The soft glow of chandeliers reflected off the polished silverware at Bellagio's, one of New York City's most exclusive restaurants. The place hummed with the gentle clinking of wine glasses and the murmur of conversations between people who could afford to spend more on a single meal than most would on a week's groceries. In the midst of this world of luxury moved Rebecca Torres, a woman with tired eyes but a determined spirit. Her black uniform was pressed perfectly despite being 3 years old, and her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun that had begun to loosen after 6 hours on her feet. "Table 12 needs their check, and 14 just arrived," called out Hank, the floor manager, as Rebecca hurried back toward the kitchen with empty plates balanced along her arm. "On it," she replied, forcing a smile. This was her second shift of the day. The morning had been spent at Joe's Diner across town, serving breakfast to construction workers and office employees. Now, as evening settled over the city, she worked among the wealthy, collecting better tips that would hopefully cover this month's rent. Behind the swinging doors that led to the kitchen was a small alcove with a desk. This was where the staff sometimes took their breaks, and where Rebecca's 8-year-old son, Miguel, sat surrounded by homework papers and colored pencils. "How's the math coming along?" Rebecca asked, setting down her tray and quickly checking her phone. No messages from the babysitter who had canceled last minute, forcing Rebecca to bring Miguel to work. Miguel looked up, his brown eyes serious behind glasses that were slightly too big for his face. "I finished it. Now I'm drawing." Rebecca glanced at the drawing, a piano with hands hovering over the keys. Her heart squeezed. Miguel had been obsessed with pianos ever since he'd seen a street performer in the park 3 months ago. The old upright piano at his school was the highlight of his week, but those 30 minutes of music class were never enough. "Just a few more hours, okay? Then we'll head home," she promised, kissing the top of his head before grabbing her notepad and hurrying back out to the dining room. As Rebecca moved between tables, refilling water glasses and taking orders, she didn't notice the man sitting alone in the corner booth. Most wouldn't have recognized him anyway, despite his face occasionally appearing in business magazines. Thomas Reinhardt had built his fortune in software development, turning a small startup into a billion-dollar company before his 40th birthday. Now, at 45, he rarely made public appearances, preferring to work behind the scenes and enjoy his wealth privately. Thomas had chosen Bellagio's not for its reputation or its food, but for its anonymity. The private booth in the corner allowed him to observe without being observed, to be among people without having to engage. Tonight, however, his usual peaceful dinner was interrupted by something unusual, a soft, hesitant note from the grand piano that sat largely for decoration near the front of the restaurant. The sound was so unexpected that conversations paused briefly before resuming. Thomas looked up from his phone to see a small boy sitting at the piano bench, his legs dangling above the floor, his fingers tentatively pressing one key, then another. Miguel had grown bored waiting in the kitchen, with Hank distracted by a complaint from a customer about their steak being overcooked. The boy had slipped through the swinging doors and into the dining room. His eyes had immediately been drawn to the gleaming black piano in the corner. The instrument stood like a magnificent creature, untouched and waiting. Miguel approached it slowly, as if it might disappear if he moved too quickly. When he reached it, he ran his fingers lightly over the smooth wood before climbing onto the bench. Rebecca was in the middle of describing the night's specials to a couple celebrating their anniversary when she heard the piano. Her words trailed off as her head snapped toward the sound. There, in full view of the restaurant's elite clientele, was Miguel, pressing keys one by one, his face a picture of concentration and wonder. "Excuse me," she said to the couple, who nodded understandingly as she rushed across the dining room. Miguel was so absorbed in the feel of the keys beneath his fingers that he didn't notice his mother until she was right beside him. "Miguel," she whispered urgently, "you can't be out here. Come on, honey." The boy looked up, disappointment washing over his face. "But Mom, I was just—" I know," Rebecca said softly, trying to keep her voice down as she felt the eyes of nearby diners on them. "But this isn't our piano and these people are trying to enjoy their dinner." With gentle hands, she lifted Miguel from the bench. He wasn't heavy, but Rebecca's back ached from hours of carrying trays, and she winced slightly as she set him down beside her. "Back to the kitchen, okay? I'll bring you some of that chocolate cake you like if you stay put until closing." Miguel nodded reluctantly, casting one last longing look at the piano before letting his mother guide him back toward the kitchen. From his corner booth, Thomas watched the scene with unexpected interest. He had come to Bellagio seeking solitude, a break from the constant demands of his company and the responsibilities that came with his wealth. Instead, he found himself captivated by the interaction between the waitress and her son. There was something in the boy's expression as he touched the piano keys, a pure, unfiltered joy that Thomas hadn't witnessed in years. And in the mother's face as she lifted her son away, he recognized a familiar struggle. The pain of having to deny someone you love something they desperately want, simply because circumstances won't allow it. Thomas picked up his glass of water, suddenly aware that he had been staring. As he took a sip, he noticed the waitress, Rebecca, according to her name tag, now at a nearby table, professionally taking an order as if the incident with her son had never happened. But Thomas could see the slight flush of embarrassment on her cheeks, the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. For the rest of his meal, Thomas found himself glancing over at Rebecca as she moved efficiently around the restaurant. There was a dignity in her work, a quiet determination that reminded him of his own mother, who had cleaned houses to support them after his father left. When Rebecca came to clear his plate, Thomas spoke to her for the first time. "Everything was excellent." "Thank you," he said. "I'm glad you enjoyed it." "Sir," she replied with the practiced response of someone who had said those words thousands of times. "Can I interest you in dessert tonight?" Thomas hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I think so. The chocolate cake, perhaps." A brief flash of recognition crossed Rebecca's face. That was the cake she had promised Miguel, but she quickly composed herself. "Excellent choice. I'll bring that right out." As she walked away, Thomas found himself wondering about her story. Where did she live? How old was her son? Did the boy have anyone to teach him piano? Or was that gleaming instrument in the corner of Bellagio's the only one he ever got to touch? These weren't the kind of thoughts Thomas usually entertained during his dinners alone. He had spent years building walls between himself and the rest of the world, finding it easier to deal with spreadsheets and investors than with the messy reality of human connections. Yet something about the waitress and her son had slipped past his defenses. When Rebecca returned with his cake, Thomas noticed the small piece wrapped in a napkin that she was carefully hiding in her apron pocket, presumably for her son. "Thank you," he said, his voice warmer than before. Rebecca nodded and turned to leave, but Thomas surprised himself by speaking again. "Your son? He seems interested in the piano." Rebecca paused, clearly caught off guard by the personal observation. For a moment, wariness crossed her features, the natural caution of a woman used to deflecting unwanted attention from male customers. "Yes," she finally said, her voice measured. "He loves music. I'm sorry if he disturbed your meal." "Not at all," Thomas assured her. "In fact, it was the most interesting part of my evening." A small, genuine smile finally broke through Rebecca's professional mask. "That's kind of you to say. He gets to play a little at school, but—" She trailed off, clearly feeling she had already said too much to a stranger. "Well, enjoy your dessert," she finished, moving away to attend to other tables. Thomas watched her go, then turned his attention to the cake before him. As he took his first bite, his mind was already turning over new thoughts, possibilities forming that hadn't been there when he'd walked into the restaurant an hour ago. By the time Thomas paid his bill, leaving a tip that was generous but not so large as to draw attention, the restaurant had begun to empty. As he stood to leave, he cast one last glance toward the kitchen doors, where he caught a glimpse of Rebecca helping Miguel put his schoolbooks into a worn backpack. Thomas stepped out into the cool evening air of Manhattan, the doorman hailing a taxi for him with a respectful nod. As he settled into the back seat and gave the driver his address, Thomas found himself thinking about pianos and music and second chances. He would return to Bellagio's, he decided, and next time he would come with a purpose. A week passed before Thomas Reinhardt returned to Bellagio's. The restaurant hadn't been far from his thoughts during that time. He'd found himself distracted during meetings, his mind wandering to the image of small fingers pressing piano keys and a mother's gentle hands lifting her son away from something he loved. Thomas arrived earlier this time, requesting the same corner booth. He brought with him a slim laptop, making it appear as though he was there on business. In reality, The screen displayed nothing but unanswered emails he had no intention of addressing tonight. "Good evening, sir. Welcome back to Bellagio's," said the host, a different one from last week but with the same polished smile. "Your usual table is ready." Thomas nodded, somewhat surprised to be remembered. He followed the host to his corner booth, settling in with a clear view of both the dining room and the grand piano that stood silently near the front. "Your server will be with you shortly," the host said, before departing. Thomas opened his laptop, pretending to work while his eyes occasionally scanned the restaurant. He spotted Rebecca almost immediately. She moved between tables with the same quiet efficiency he had noticed before. But tonight she looked even more tired. There were shadows under her eyes, and twice he saw her press a hand against her lower back when she thought no one was watching. When she approached his table, recognition flickered in her eyes. "Good evening," she said, setting down a glass of water. "Nice to see you again. Our special tonight is seared scallops with a lemon butter sauce and spring vegetables." Thomas closed his laptop. "That sounds perfect. I'll have that and a glass of the house white wine." Rebecca nodded, jotting down his order. As she turned to leave, Thomas spoke again. "Is your son here tonight?" The question came out more abruptly than he'd intended. Rebecca paused, a hint of protective caution crossing her face. "Yes, my regular sitter is on vacation this week." She seemed unsure whether to say more, then added, "He's in the back with his homework." Thomas nodded. He seemed very drawn to the piano last week. A small, sad smile touched Rebecca's lips. "He's always been that way with music. Even as a baby, he would stop crying when I played the radio." She glanced toward the kitchen, then back at Thomas. "I should get your order in." As she walked away, Thomas noticed how other servers moved with a certain lightness, making small talk with customers. Rebecca was different. She was polite and professional, but there was a heaviness about her, as if she carried unseen weights. Thomas sipped his water and waited. He didn't have to wait long. About 20 minutes later, as his dinner arrived, he noticed a small figure slipping out from the kitchen doors. Miguel, with his two big glasses and serious expression, glanced around the restaurant before his eyes locked onto the piano. Like a moth drawn to a flame, he made his way toward it, careful to stay close to the walls and away from the busy servers. Rebecca was at the far end of the restaurant, explaining the dessert options to a table of business people. She hadn't noticed her son's escape. Thomas watched as Miguel approached the piano with the same reverence he had shown the week before. This time, however, the boy seemed more confident. He climbed onto the bench and, after a moment's hesitation, placed both hands on the keys. What happened next made Thomas set down his fork. Miguel began to play. It wasn't just random notes this time, but a simple, recognizable melody. "Twinkle, twinkle, little star." His small fingers moved slowly but deliberately, finding each note with careful precision. It wasn't perfect. He missed a few notes and the timing was uneven, but it was unmistakably music. The nearest diners turned to look, some smiling, others merely curious. Miguel didn't notice them. His entire world had narrowed to the black and white keys beneath his fingers. Thomas found himself holding his breath. Where had the boy learned this? Did he have a keyboard at home? Or had he simply remembered the positions of the keys from watching others? The simple tune came to an end, and Miguel immediately began again, this time a little more confidently. He made it halfway through before Rebecca noticed. Thomas saw the moment she spotted her son. She had been returning to the kitchen with an empty tray when she froze, her eyes widening. For a second, she didn't move, watching Miguel play with an expression that mixed pride, love, and dismay in equal measure. Then she set down her tray and hurried across the dining room. "Miguel," she whispered, loud enough that Thomas could hear from his nearby table. "Honey, you know you can't be out here." Miguel looked up, his hands still on the keys. "Mom, I'm playing the song we practice on Mrs. Wilson's keyboard, listen." He started to play again, but Rebecca gently placed her hand over his. "I know, and it sounds beautiful. But you can't play here. This piano belongs to the restaurant." "But no one else is using it," Miguel argued, his voice rising slightly. A few more diners turned to look, Rebecca's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "Miguel, please," she said, her voice strained. "I could get in trouble." The boy's shoulders slumped, but he nodded. Rebecca helped him off the bench, wincing again as she lifted him. This time, Thomas clearly saw the pain cross her face, not just the physical discomfort of a strained back. but the deeper pain of having to deny her child something that brought him joy. As they walked past his table, Thomas made a decision. "Excuse me," he called softly. Rebecca stopped, turning toward him with a professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm sorry about that," she said. "Can I get you anything else?" Thomas shook his head. "No need to apologize. Actually, I wanted to tell your son that I enjoyed his playing." Miguel looked up, surprised and pleased. "Really?" "Really," Thomas confirmed. "Where did you learn that song?" Rebecca kept a protective hand on her son's shoulder, but allowed the conversation. "At school," Miguel answered. "Mrs. Wilson lets me practice on her keyboard during lunch sometimes, and Mom sings it with me at home." "We don't have a piano," Rebecca explained, a hint of defensiveness in her voice. "But Miguel has a good ear. He remembers the notes." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "That's impressive. Most people need lots of practice to learn piano." Miguel beamed at the praise. "I practice whenever I can. Mrs. Wilson says I'm a natural." "I believe she's right," Thomas said. Then, addressing Rebecca, "Would it be all right if he played a bit more? I'm enjoying the music with my dinner." Rebecca hesitated, glancing toward Hank, who was busy at the host stand. "I don't think that would be allowed. The piano is just for decoration, really. Sometimes they hire a professional for special events, but—" "I understand," Thomas said. "Perhaps another time." Rebecca gave him a grateful smile. "Thank you for being so kind about it. Come on, Miguel. Back to your homework." As they walked away, Thomas heard Miguel ask, "Mom, who is that man?" "Just a customer, honey," Rebecca replied. "A nice one." Thomas finished his meal slowly, his mind turning over new thoughts. When Rebecca returned to clear his plate, he ordered coffee and dessert, extending his stay. "Has your son always been interested in music?" he asked as she set down his coffee. Rebecca seemed more willing to talk now. Perhaps it was his obvious interest in Miguel's playing, or simply the fact that the restaurant was growing quieter as the evening progressed. "Always," she said. "His father was musical, played guitar in a band. He left when Miguel was 2, but I think some of that talent got passed down." She smiled fondly. "Miguel hums in his sleep sometimes." "It's a special gift," Thomas said. "Has he had any formal lessons?" The question brought back the shadow to Rebecca's face. "No, not yet. I'm saving up, but with rent and after-school care—" She trailed off, then straightened her shoulders. "We make do. He uses apps on my phone sometimes, and his music teacher at school is very encouraging." Thomas nodded, understanding the unspoken reality of her situation. A single mother working double shifts could hardly afford the luxury of piano lessons, let alone an instrument. "Well, he's very good for someone without formal training," Thomas said. "You should be proud." "I am," Rebecca said, and for the first time that evening her smile reached her eyes. Every day. As the restaurant began to empty, Thomas paid his bill. This time, he left a tip that was impossible to ignore, enough to make Rebecca pause when she found it, her eyes widening in disbelief. Outside, as he waited for his car, Thomas made a phone call. "Daniel," he said when his assistant answered, "I need you to find out something for me. There's a waitress at Bellagio's named Rebecca. I need to know her full name and a bit more about her situation. She has a son named Miguel, about 8 years old, with an interest in piano." He paused. "And see if you can find out which school the boy attends." "May I ask why, sir?" Daniel's voice was professional, without judgment. Thomas watched the city lights reflecting in the puddles from an earlier rain shower. "I'm considering a new project," he said finally. "Something personal." As his car arrived, Thomas took one last look at the restaurant. Through the window, he could see Rebecca gathering her things, Miguel at her side, his backpack slung over one shoulder. They looked tired but resilient, a small team of 2 against the world. Thomas slid into the backseat of his car. "Home," he told the driver. But as the car pulled away from the curb, he knew that his next visit to Bellagio's would come sooner rather than later, and it would be different in ways that neither Rebecca nor Miguel could possibly imagine. Thomas returned to Bellagio's exactly 1 week later. This time he arrived with a purpose and a plan. He had spent the intervening days learning everything he could about Rebecca Torres and her son Miguel. His assistant Daniel had been thorough but respectful in his research. Rebecca was 32 years old, a single mother who worked 3 jobs to make ends meet. Besides Bellagio's in the evenings, she served breakfast at Joe's Diner in the mornings and cleaned offices on weekends. She lived in a one-bedroom apartment in a modest neighborhood, the kind of place where neighbors looked out for each other because they had to. Miguel attended Washington Elementary, where his teacher, Mrs. Wilson, did indeed let him practice on her personal keyboard during lunch breaks. The boy was in the 3rd grade, getting mostly A's despite his mother's hectic work schedule. He had never taken formal music lessons, but according to his school records, his music teacher had noted his exceptional natural ability and rare intuitive understanding of musical patterns. What struck Thomas most was the absence of complaints or excuses in the story. Rebecca had never applied for special assistance at Miguel's school, never asked for extensions on rent, which she always paid on time if just barely, never sought sympathy for her circumstances. She simply worked harder when things got tough. Thomas recognized that kind of quiet determination. It reminded him of his own mother, who had never once complained about the hand life had dealt her after his father left. She had simply done what needed to be done, working multiple jobs to give Thomas the opportunities that eventually led to his success. Now, sitting in his usual corner booth at Bellagio's, Thomas watched Rebecca moving between tables with the same efficient grace he had observed before. There was no sign of Miguel yet, but Thomas knew from his previous visits that the boy usually emerged from the kitchen later in the evening, drawn inevitably to the piano. When Rebecca approached his table, he noticed a flicker of recognition in her eyes. "Good evening," she said with a polite smile. "Our special tonight is grilled salmon with a dill sauce and roasted potatoes." "That sounds perfect," Thomas replied. "And a glass of white wine, please." As Rebecca turned to leave, Thomas added, "I was hoping your son might play the piano again tonight." "He's quite talented." Rebecca paused, her professional demeanor slipping for just a moment. "That's very kind of you to say, but I've asked him to stay in the back tonight. I don't want to disturb the other guests." Thomas nodded, understanding her caution. "Of course. I just wanted you to know that at least one guest enjoys his playing." A genuine smile touched Rebecca's lips. "Thank you. That means a lot to him, to us both." As she walked away, Thomas settled in to wait. He had a feeling that despite Rebecca's best efforts, Miguel would find his way to the piano again. Some passions were simply too strong to contain. His prediction proved correct. About halfway through his meal, Thomas spotted Miguel slipping out from the kitchen. The boy paused, looking around carefully, then made his way to the piano with the stealth of someone who knew he was bending the rules. This time, when Miguel began to play, it wasn't just "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star." He started with that familiar tune, but then transitioned into something that sounded like the beginning of Mozart's Eine kleine Nachtmusik. It wasn't perfect, some notes were missed, and the timing wasn't quite right, but it was remarkably close for a child playing by ear. Several diners turned to look, their expressions a mix of surprise and delight. An elderly couple at a nearby table smiled at each other, the woman's eyes growing misty as she watched the small boy playing with such concentration. Thomas set down his fork and simply listened. There was something pure about the moment, a child discovering his gift, sharing it without self-consciousness or pretense. In his world of corporate deals and strategic acquisitions, such genuine moments were rare. Rebecca was at the far end of the restaurant when Miguel began to play. Thomas watched as she turned, hearing the music, her face registering first alarm, then resignation, and finally a flash of unmistakable pride as she realized what her son was playing. She made her way across the dining room, but before she could reach Miguel, something unexpected happened. Hank, the floor manager, stepped out from behind the host's stand. His face was tight with annoyance as he strode toward the piano. "Excuse me," he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "Young man, you need to stop that immediately. This is not a playground." Miguel's hands froze above the keys, his eyes wide behind his glasses. The music cut off abruptly, leaving an awkward silence in its wake. "I'm sorry," Miguel said in a small voice. Rebecca hurried forward. "Hank, I'm so sorry. It won't happen again." The manager turned to her, keeping his voice low but not quite low enough to prevent Thomas from hearing. "Rebecca, I've been patient because you're a good server, but this can't continue. The piano is worth more than you make in a year. If he damages it, it's coming out of your paycheck." Rebecca's face paled. "I understand. It won't happen again." As she reached for Miguel's hand, Thomas stood up. He wasn't entirely sure what he was going to do until he found himself walking toward them. "Excuse me," he said. his voice carrying the quiet authority that had served him well in countless boardrooms. Hank turned, his expression shifting immediately from annoyance to customer service politeness. "I apologize for the disruption, sir. We're handling the situation." "Actually," Thomas said, "I was hoping the young man could continue playing. I was enjoying it." Rebecca looked at him with surprise while Miguel's face brightened with hope. Hank shook his head. "I'm sorry, sir, but the piano is for professional entertainment only. We sometimes hire pianists for special events, but we can't allow children to play with it." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "I see, and who would I speak to about changing that policy? The owner, perhaps?" Hank blinked, thrown off balance by the question. "Well, Mr. Castellano owns the restaurant, but he's not here tonight." "I see," Thomas said again. Then, making a decision that surprised even himself, he added, "What if I were to rent the piano for the evening?" "Rent the—" "I don't understand," Hank stammered. "It's simple," Thomas explained, reaching for his wallet. "I'd like to hire this young man as tonight's entertainment." He pulled out his credit card, the black one that had never been declined anywhere. "I'm willing to pay whatever the usual pianist would charge, plus a generous tip for the restaurant's trouble." Rebecca stepped forward. "Sir, that's very kind, but you don't have to." "I know I don't have to," Thomas interrupted gently. "But I'd like to. Music should be shared, don't you think?" Miguel looked up at his mother, then at Thomas, his eyes wide with a mixture of hope and disbelief. Hank seemed completely at a loss. I would need to call Mr. Castellano." "Please do," Thomas said. "Tell him that Thomas Reinhardt would consider it a personal favor." At the mention of his name, Hank's expression changed. Even if he didn't recognize Thomas on sight, the name Reinhardt was familiar to anyone in the business world. "Of course. Mr. Reinhardt, I'll call him right away." As Hank hurried off to make the call, Rebecca turned to Thomas, her expression a mix of gratitude and confusion. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. Thomas considered the question. Why was he doing this? Was it just because Miguel reminded him of himself as a child, passionate about something but limited by circumstances? Or was it because Rebecca's quiet dignity and hard work reminded him of his mother? Or was it simply because in a world where he could buy nearly anything, the simple joy on a child's face when playing music was something refreshingly authentic? "Because music matters," he said finally. "And because your son has a gift that deserves to be heard." Miguel, who had been listening to the adults talk, looked up at Thomas with solemn eyes. "Are you really going to let me play the piano?" "For everyone?" Thomas nodded. "If your mother agrees and if the owner gives permission, yes." Miguel turned to Rebecca, his face alight with excitement. "Please, Mom, can I?" Rebecca looked at her son, then at Thomas, uncertainty clear in her expression. "I don't know, Miguel. Mr. Reinhardt is being very generous, but nothing," Thomas said gently. "Consider it my gift to the other diners. Good music enhances a meal, doesn't it?" Before Rebecca could respond, Hank returned, his manner completely transformed. "Mr. Castellano says it would be an honor to accommodate Mr. Reinhardt's request. He sends his regards and hopes you're enjoying your meal." Thomas smiled. "Excellent. Then it's settled." He turned to Miguel. "Would you like to play for us tonight?" The boy's face lit up with a smile so bright it seemed to illuminate the entire restaurant. "Yes, can I really?" "You really can," Thomas assured him. "And I have a suggestion if you're open to it. What if we moved the piano to a more central location? That way everyone can enjoy your playing." Miguel nodded enthusiastically, while Rebecca still looked stunned by the turn of events. Hank, now eager to please, called over 2 waiters to help move the grand piano to a spot near the center of the restaurant, where it could be seen and heard from every table. As the piano was being repositioned, Thomas addressed the other diners. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying easily across the room, "with the restaurant's permission, we have a special treat tonight. Young Miguel here is going to provide us with some music to accompany our dinner. I hope you'll join me in encouraging this remarkable young talent." A murmur of interest ran through the restaurant. Most of the diners seemed intrigued, though a few looked skeptical. Miguel approached the piano with newfound confidence, climbing onto the bench as Thomas stood beside him. The boy looked up at him, then at his mother, who gave him an encouraging nod despite the tears that had gathered in her eyes. With a deep breath, Miguel placed his hands on the keys and began to play. The restaurant fell silent as Miguel's small fingers touched the keys. He began with Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, the simple melody floating through the dining room. Some diners exchanged glances, perhaps wondering why this child's playing warranted such special treatment. But then, something remarkable happened. As Miguel finished the familiar tune, he paused for just a moment before transitioning into the opening notes of Beethoven's Für Elise. Though simplified and played at a careful pace, the melody was unmistakable. The diner's expressions changed from polite interest to genuine surprise. Thomas, standing near the piano, felt a surge of emotion that caught him off guard. He had suspected Miguel had talent, but this was beyond what he had imagined. The boy played with a natural feel for the music that couldn't be taught, a raw gift that only needed nurturing to flourish. Rebecca stood frozen a few feet away, her serving tray clutched tightly against her chest, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. The pride in her eyes was unmistakable, mingled with a kind of bittersweet joy that Thomas recognized all too well. The look of a parent witnessing their child's potential, while acutely aware of the barriers that stood in the way. Without thinking, Thomas moved to the piano bench and sat beside Miguel. The boy glanced up, momentarily startled but not breaking his rhythm. "May I join you?" Thomas asked softly. Miguel nodded, his concentration still firmly on the keys. Thomas placed his hands on the higher octaves of the keyboard and began to play a complementary melody that harmonized with Für Elise. The restaurant guests stirred with renewed interest as they realized that the well-dressed stranger was not just a patron but a skilled pianist himself. What none of them knew, what even Rebecca couldn't have guessed, was that before Thomas Reinhardt became a tech billionaire, before he founded his company or earned his first million, he had been a scholarship student at a prestigious music conservatory. Piano had been his first love, his escape from the hardships of growing up with a single mother who worked herself to exhaustion to give him opportunities. He had abandoned music for business because it offered more security, a way to ensure his mother would never have to clean another house or work another double shift. The choice had paid off beyond anyone's wildest expectations. But something had been lost along the way, something he was rediscovering now. Playing alongside this gifted child, Miguel's eyes widened as Thomas's skilled accompaniment elevated his simple playing into something more complex and beautiful. The boy didn't falter. Instead, he seemed to draw confidence from the support, his own playing becoming more assured. As they played together, the restaurant came alive. Phones appeared from pockets and purses as diners began recording the unexpected duet. Waitstaff paused in their duties, trays balanced carefully as they stopped to listen. Even Hank, the manager who had been so dismissive of Miguel's playing earlier, stood by the host stand with an expression of astonishment. When the piece came to an end, there was a moment of silence, that precious, weightless moment after music stops but before the spell is broken. Then the restaurant erupted in applause. Not the polite, obligatory kind, but genuine, enthusiastic appreciation. Miguel beamed, his face flushed with excitement. He turned to Thomas with wide eyes. "How did you know how to play with me?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder. Thomas smiled. "Music is a language. When someone speaks it as clearly as you do, it's easy to join the conversation." The boy considered this with serious eyes. "Can you teach me more?" "I only know a few songs." Before Thomas could answer, a gentleman from a nearby table approached the piano. He was well dressed, in his 60s, with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone used to authority. "Excuse me," he said, addressing Thomas. "That was extraordinary. Are you giving a lesson?" Thomas shook his head. "Just enjoying some music with a talented young man." The gentleman nodded, then turned to Miguel. "Young man, I'm Professor Chen from the Manhattan School of Music. Would you mind playing something else for me?" "Anything you like." Miguel looked at his mother, seeking permission. Rebecca, who had managed to compose herself somewhat, nodded encouragingly despite the clear shock on her face at this new development. Miguel turned back to the piano and began to play again. This time, he chose the theme from a popular movie soundtrack that had been playing everywhere for months. Though he hit some wrong notes and simplified the difficult passages, the melody was clear and recognizable. Professor Chen watched with increasing interest, his trained eye catching what others might miss. The natural positioning of the boy's hands, the instinctive way he corrected his mistakes, the pure joy that radiated from him as he played. When Miguel finished, the professor turned to Rebecca. Is he your son? Rebecca nodded, moving closer protectively. Yes, I'm Rebecca Torres. He has remarkable natural ability, Ms. Torres. Has he had formal training? No, Rebecca admitted. He plays at school sometimes, and we practice fingering on a paper keyboard at home. We don't have a piano. The professor's eyebrows rose. No training? And he's playing like this? He shook his head in amazement. In my 40 years of teaching, I've rarely seen such natural talent. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. I would very much like to discuss his musical education. The school has scholarship programs for exceptional students. Rebecca took the card with trembling fingers. Thank you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. That's very kind. As Professor Chen returned to his table, other diners began to approach the piano. An older woman with elegant jewelry told Miguel that her late husband had been a concert pianist, and his playing reminded her of the joy music had brought to their home. A young couple asked if he took requests. A family with children about Miguel's age watched with admiration from nearby. Through it all, Thomas remained seated at the piano bench, observing the scene with a mixture of satisfaction and something deeper, a sense that he was witnessing a turning point in two lives. When the crowd around the piano finally thinned, Thomas turned to Miguel. Would you like to play one more piece before people finish their meals? Miguel nodded eagerly, but then his face grew serious. Will you play with me again? It would be my honor, Thomas replied. This time they chose a simple folk melody that Thomas thought Miguel might know. To his delight, the boy picked it up quickly, and soon they were playing a duet as if they had rehearsed for weeks. Thomas gradually increased the complexity of his part, challenging Miguel to follow, and the boy responded with impressive musicality. As they played, Rebecca stood nearby, watching her son with an expression that had transformed from worry to wonder. The weight that seemed to press down on her shoulders had lifted somewhat, replaced by a cautious hope. When the final notes faded away, the applause was even more enthusiastic than before. Miguel bowed shyly, a gesture he must have seen performers do on television. Thomas stood and placed a hand lightly on the boy's shoulder, turning him to face the audience properly for his moment of recognition. Ladies and gentlemen, Thomas said, raising his voice to be heard over the applause, thank you for your kindness to this young artist. Music is a gift that should be shared, and tonight Miguel has reminded us of that. As the applause continued, Thomas stepped aside, ensuring that the moment belonged fully to Miguel. The boy's face glowed with a joy so pure it seemed to light him from within. When the excitement finally began to settle, and diners returned to their meals, Thomas approached Rebecca, who had been watching from a few feet away. Your son is extraordinary, he said quietly. I know, she replied, her voice thick with emotion. I've always known. She trailed off, the unspoken barriers, money, time, opportunity, hanging in the air between them. Thomas nodded in understanding. Then, making a decision, he said, Ms. Torres, I'd like to speak with you about Miguel's future if you have a moment. Rebecca's expression turned guarded. His future? His musical future, Thomas clarified. I believe he has exceptional talent that deserves to be nurtured. Before Rebecca could respond, Miguel rushed over, his eyes bright with excitement.
Mom, did you see?
Everyone was clapping. And I played with him. He pointed at Thomas. And that man gave you a card and said I have talent. Rebecca smiled, running a hand gently through her son's hair. I saw, honey. You were amazing. Can we do it again? Can I play here again? Rebecca looked at Thomas, a question in her eyes. I think that could be arranged, Thomas said. But I have a better idea. What if you could play on a piano every day? Not just here at the restaurant. Miguel's eyes widened. Every day, how? Thomas glanced at Rebecca, seeking permission to continue. After a moment's hesitation, she gave a small nod. I have a foundation, Thomas explained, kneeling down to Miguel's level. It helps talented young people like you develop their gifts. I'd like to offer you a scholarship for piano lessons and a proper instrument to practice on. Miguel's mouth fell open. A real piano? At our house? If that's what you and your mother want, Thomas said carefully, standing up to address Rebecca again. No strings attached. Just an opportunity for an exceptional child to explore his gift. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears again, but she blinked them back. Why would you do this for us? You don't even know us. Thomas thought about his own childhood, about his mother who had sacrificed everything to give him a chance, about the scholarship that had changed the course of his life. Let's just say I recognize something in Miguel that reminds me of myself at his age, he said, and I believe that talent like his shouldn't be limited by circumstances. As they stood there in the middle of the restaurant, surrounded by the quiet hum of conversation and the soft clink of silverware, something shifted between them. A connection formed. A possibility opened. Miguel looked from his mother to Thomas and back again, sensing that something important was happening but not fully understanding what. "Can I, Mom?" he asked, his voice full of hope. "Can I learn to play like him?" Rebecca looked down at her son, then at Thomas, measuring him with her gaze. Whatever she saw in his eyes must have reassured her, because she straightened her shoulders and made a decision. "Yes," she said softly. "Yes, you can." Year had passed since that remarkable night at Bellagio's restaurant. The morning sun streamed through tall windows into a spacious practice room at the Manhattan School of Music. Miguel sat at a gleaming black grand piano, his fingers dancing across the keys as he worked through a challenging passage of Chopin's Minute Waltz. At 10 years old now, he was still small for his age, but his musical presence had grown enormously. "Good, Miguel," said his teacher, Professor Chen, the same man who had approached him that fateful night. "But remember to let it breathe. This piece tells a story. It's not just about playing the right notes quickly." Miguel nodded, his face serious with concentration. He began again, this time allowing slight pauses between phrases, giving the music room to speak. The difference was subtle but transformative, changing the piece from an exercise in technique to a genuine expression of emotion. Professor Chen smiled. "Much better. Your technical skills are progressing wonderfully, but it's your musicality, your ability to feel the music that makes you special." Miguel beamed at the praise, then glanced at the clock on the wall. "Is it time yet?" The professor checked his watch. "Almost. Why don't you play through the Mozart sonata one more time? That's what you're performing tonight after all." As Miguel began the sonata, the door to the practice room opened quietly. Rebecca slipped in, watching her son with undisguised pride. She looked different than she had a year ago. Less tired, more confident. She still worked at Bellagio's, but now as the evening manager rather than a waitress. The hours were better, the pay was higher, and most importantly, it allowed her to spend more time with Miguel. When Miguel finished playing, she applauded softly. "That was beautiful, honey." Miguel spun around on the piano bench. "Mom, I didn't know you were here already." "I got off work early. Big night tonight." She turned to Professor Chen. "How is he doing?" "Remarkably well," the professor replied. "He's progressing faster than any student I've taught in decades. The scholarship committee is very pleased." The scholarship had been the first of many changes in their lives. Thomas Reinhardt, true to his word, had arranged for Miguel to audition for the Manhattan School of Music's Young Artists program. The boy's natural talent had so impressed the committee that they had offered him a full scholarship on the spot. But Thomas hadn't stopped there. Through his foundation, he had provided a piano for their apartment, a beautiful upright that fit perfectly in the corner of their living room. When their landlord had complained about the noise, Thomas had helped them find a new apartment in a building with better soundproofing and a more supportive community. Rebecca had initially been hesitant to accept so much help from a stranger, no matter how wealthy or well-intentioned, but Thomas had been careful to frame everything as an investment in Miguel's talent, rather than charity. "Think of it as a business decision," he had told her. "I'm investing in the future of music. Miguel is going to be someone special one day." And day by day that prediction was proving true. Miguel's natural gift, combined with formal training and endless hours of practice, had blossomed into something extraordinary. His first student recital had led to an invitation to play with a youth orchestra. That performance had caught the attention of local media, which led to a feature story in the city newspaper. The video of Miguel playing with Thomas at Bellagio's had gone viral, viewed millions of times online. People were captivated not just by the boy's talent, but by the story behind it, the hard-working single mother, the chance encounter with a billionaire, the power of music to bridge worlds. "Are you nervous about tonight?" Rebecca asked, straightening Miguel's collar. Miguel shrugged. "A little, but Mr. Reinhardt says it's good to be nervous." It means you care about doing well. Thomas had become a regular presence in their lives over the past year, not overbearing but supportive. He attended Miguel's recitals, occasionally joined him for lessons, and sometimes simply came over for dinner, bringing takeout food and stories about his own early days studying music. Rebecca had been surprised to learn that Thomas had once been a serious piano student himself. "Why did you switch to business?" she had asked him once. "Security," he had answered simply. "My mother worked so hard to give me opportunities. I wanted to make sure I could take care of her someday." He had paused, looking at Miguel practicing at the piano. "But sometimes I wonder what might have been if I'd stayed with music." Tonight was the culmination of the year's work, a benefit concert for Thomas's newly established Music for All Foundation, which provided instruments and lessons to talented children from low-income families across the city. Miguel would be performing as the special guest, alongside professional musicians and other young scholarship recipients. "We should get going," Professor Chen said, checking his watch again. "They'll want Miguel for the sound check soon." As they gathered their things and headed out, Rebecca felt a flutter of anxiety. The concert was being held at Lincoln Center, a far cry from the casual audience at Bellagio's restaurant. There would be hundreds of people there, including potential donors to the foundation and important figures from the music world. "What if I mess up?" Miguel asked suddenly as they walked toward the exit, voicing the fear that had been hiding behind his confidence. Rebecca squeezed his hand. "Then you'll keep going, just like you do in practice. But you won't mess up. You know these pieces by heart. And remember," Professor Chen added, "perfection isn't what moves people. It's the emotion, the story you tell through the music. That's what they'll remember." Miguel nodded, seeming to take comfort in this reminder. When they arrived at Lincoln Center, the backstage area was a flurry of activity. Stagehands moved equipment, musicians warmed up in corners, and organizers with clipboards hurried from person to person with last-minute instructions. Thomas met them at the artist's entrance, his usual business suit replaced by a formal tuxedo. "There's our star," he said, smiling warmly at Miguel. "Ready for your big night?" Miguel took a deep breath and nodded. "I think so." "Good. They're ready for your sound check on stage. Professor Chen, would you mind going with him? I'd like a word with Rebecca." As Miguel and his teacher headed toward the stage, Thomas turned to Rebecca. "How are you holding up?" "Nervous," she admitted. "More nervous than he is, I think." "That's being a parent," Thomas said with a smile. "My mother used to say she felt every note I played, every mistake, every triumph as if it were happening to her." Rebecca nodded in understanding. "Exactly. It's like my heart is walking around outside my body, sitting at that piano." They were quiet for a moment, watching as Miguel walked onto the vast stage, looking tiny against the backdrop of the empty concert hall. "I wanted to thank you," Rebecca said finally, "not just for tonight, but for everything this past year." "You've changed our lives." Thomas shook his head. "Miguel's talent changed your lives. I just helped clear a few obstacles." "A few?" Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "The scholarship, the piano, the apartment, this foundation. That's more than a few obstacles, Thomas." He smiled at the use of his first name, something Rebecca had only recently become comfortable with. "Maybe. But do you know what the best part of this whole experience has been for me?" "What?" "Rediscovering my love for music," he said simply. "Watching Miguel play, seeing his joy, it reminded me of why I started playing in the first place. Before it became about competitions and pressure and living up to expectations." Rebecca studied his face, seeing the genuine emotion there. Over the past year, she had come to know this complicated man, not just as a wealthy benefactor, but as someone who understood what it meant to grow up with limitations, to have dreams that seemed out of reach. "Will you play tonight too?" she asked. "People have been asking about the man in the video." Thomas shook his head. "No, tonight is Miguel's night. And the other scholarship students. This is about their future, not my past." Before Rebecca could respond, they were interrupted by one of the organizers. "Mr. Reinhardt, we need you for a final review of the program. And Ms. Torres, we have a seat reserved for you in the front row." As Thomas was led away, he turned back to Rebecca. "Just wait until you hear what Miguel has planned for the finale. It's going to be something special." 3 hours later, the concert hall was filled with a standing ovation. Miguel stood center stage, his small frame nearly dwarfed by the grand piano. his face flushed with the thrill of performance. He had played Mozart with technical precision that belied his age, but it was his encore piece, a composition of his own, that had brought the audience to its feet. The piece was simple but deeply moving, a melody that seemed to speak of hope and perseverance. As the applause continued, Miguel gestured to the side of the stage where Thomas stood watching. After a moment's hesitation, Thomas walked out to join him. The audience's applause grew even louder as people recognized him from the viral video. Miguel whispered something to him and Thomas shook his head, but the boy insisted. Finally, Thomas sat down at the piano beside Miguel. Together, they began to play a duet version of Miguel's composition. The teacher and student, the billionaire and the boy from humble beginnings, united by their love of music. In the front row, Rebecca watched through tears of joy. 1 year ago, she had been a waitress struggling to make ends meet, lifting her son away from a piano he longed to play. Now she was watching him perform at Lincoln Center, his talent recognized and nurtured, his future bright with possibilities. As the duet came to an end, Miguel and Thomas stood together to take a bow. The applause was thunderous, but Rebecca barely heard it. She was focused on her son's face, radiant with the pure joy that comes from doing what you were born to do. Later, at the reception, as Miguel was surrounded by admirers and Thomas spoke with potential donors, Professor Chen appeared at Rebecca's side. "Your son is going to change the world of music," he said quietly. "You know that, don't you?" Rebecca nodded, watching as Miguel animatedly described his composition process to an elderly composer who was listening with genuine interest. "He already has," she replied. "At least he's changed our world." And across the room, catching her eye, Thomas raised his glass in a silent toast, to music, to chance encounters, and to the extraordinary things that can happen when talent meets opportunity. When someone takes the time to notice a child at a piano and decides to make a difference,